All right, so let's now talk about the different types that you can have. So the different variable types that you can have in PHP are these 8. These are the basic 8 types. Okay, so you have integer numbers, which are always going to be whole numbers. Floating point numbers, those are going to be decimal numbers. Okay, those are 2 different types, a whole number and a floating point number, totally different. Okay, so strings. Oh, and let me back up for a second. I should say that integers, which are whole numbers, can also be negative, and 0 is also an integer. Those are all considered whole numbers. If you had negative 5.5, however, that would be a floating point number or decimal, and a lot of times I'll refer to floating point numbers as floats. Okay, we just talked a little bit about strings in the example that I gave you for using the variable something as cake. So strings are going to be basically alphanumeric characters that are mixed in together. All right, Boolean is another type. Booleans are essentially true-false. They can either hold one or the other value. That's it. They don't really hold any other kind of value. It's just yes or no, true, false, on, off. You know, that kind of electrical switch binary decision. All right, we also have arrays. This type is it's what we're going to refer to later as a compound type, and it can hold multiple values as opposed to just one value. So arrays will hold multiple types, and not only will they hold multiple values, but they can hold multiple types. So an array is a storage of any number of these different other things. Okay. Also, we have objects. We're not going to really get deeply into that whenever we're doing our PHP programming. You're going to be more exposed to that like in a content management system where you're not really doing that kind of programming, but you'll be exposed to it and you might need to sort of navigate around it and stuff. But objects are collections. Anyway, we'll get to that later. So resources, again, we're not going to be getting deeply into that as we're actually writing and authoring our own PHP, but you'll see how resources later are used in the semester with content management systems. And then there's also null. Null is basically nothing, but it has a meaning. Like, so if something is null, it means it's an empty value, and it's different than 0. 0 actually is a value. It's actually a number. It's an integer. Whereas null, it's sort of existentially just doesn't even exist. Okay, it's very philosophical, in fact. Okay, so all right, these data types fall into 3 basic categories. Okay, one is called scalar. It's sometimes referred to as a primitive variable type, and they only hold a single value. All right, that's important. You can't have multiple values inside of these. So an integer is a number, but it can only hold one value. So like the number 6, okay, or the number 10. All right, floating point, decimals, right? It can only hold one value. Strings can only hold a value, single value, and Booleans can only hold one value. In fact, you only even have 2 choices within that single value that it holds, and that's either true or false. Okay. Another type is compound. A compound data type is something that holds a collection of values. So, like I said before, an array. So, an example would be like if you were talking about fruit, and you wanted to make a variable called fruit, and it could be any one of, several different things: apples, oranges, pears. Right? It can hold apples, oranges, pears as 3 different options for the value of fruit. Okay, so objects. As I said before, we're not going to get much into it because we're not going to be discussing object-oriented programming, but we will be exposed to it, even though we're not going to really use it in our authoring. Okay, and then we have a couple special cases. Resources and null fall under special cases. So let's actually go ahead and start with those 2 first, since they're special. Resources are not actually exactly a data type. We call them a data type, but really it's storing, basically it's the storing of a reference to functions and resources that are external to PHP. A really common example of a resource would be a database call. So, like, I'm not going to go into it, but whenever you make a call to a database and then it returns some values back to you, you're basically going to have to store the returned database call back so that you can then translate the database call into some variables. Don't worry if that sounds confusing. It's really not that big of a deal once you actually get into it and look at it. And then null is special, and I just explained that it is not the same as assigning a value of 0. 0 really does exist. It is the concept of nothing. Okay, it's just an empty value, not there. Okay. So scalar data types. Let's talk about those. So character string, like for instance, if you were to have a string like hi there, that's a single value. There's no practical limit on the length of the string. Integers, like I said before, it could be any number, like a negative whole number, 0, any positive whole number, but it has to be a whole number. Okay, floating point, decimals. Boolean, true, false. Talked about that. Compound. Compound just means that it holds more than one thing, more than one value in its set of values. So an array is the most common type, and I already gave you kind of the example of using fruit to represent potentially apples, oranges, grapes, or pears. All right, objects. This is more advanced. Basically, what objects are collections of other values differently than arrays, but in fact, they can hold arrays. So, but we're not going to talk about that. Basically, it's when you start getting into classes and calling classes and stuff, but we're not going to be authoring that kind of stuff yet. Okay, and then there's the Boolean type, which is not its own, like I was talking about scalar and compound and so forth. All right, but Boolean is technically it's a scalar type, but we didn't really address what it is. Kind of, it's just true or false. But what does that mean? What does true and false mean? Okay, so here's some things that PHP actually considers false. So the actual string, the word false, okay, which can be upper or lowercase. All right, either one of those things means false. If it sees false in lowercase or false in uppercase, it's going to know. All right, that's the Boolean value of false. Integer of 0 is going to evaluate to be false. The float of 0.0 will evaluate to be false. An empty string, which is ultimately null, but an empty string will evaluate to be false. One character string of 0, which is different, by the way, than the integer of 0. Right? Integer of 0 is interpreted as a number, whereas a character string of 0 is interpreted as a string. But PHP sort of does this best guess, and it will say, hey, that's a 0, so I'm going to convert that into being false if it's in the right context. And the constant null, okay, which is the concept of nothing, that's going to end up being false. Those are things that PHP interprets as false. Now, typically you're going to end up using Boolean values when you're evaluating an expression, like is A greater than B or something like that. It's either going to be true or it's going to be false, depending on what the values of A and B are. Okay, so that's usually how you're going to be using Boolean types. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end this this demo, or not demo, but this lecture here. And then the next one, we're going to talk about data type conversion and assignment.